As always, much love and thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And to reiterate, Skillshare is an online learning community filled with classes for the creative mind. If you're looking to do something other than check your Twitter notifications every waking second of your life, well, here you go. If you're unsure if an education after high school is the right decision for you, or maybe you have finished school and you think you can branch out into other things, Skillshare has what you need to supply you with additional knowledge along with fellow like-minded creatives. And for this month, I'm recommending Productivity for Creatives. Build a System That Brings Out Your Best by Thomas Frank. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that we can all work on our productivity. Physical workspace, digital workspace, it doesn't matter. Needs work. How many tabs do you have open on your browser right now? Yeah, Mr. Frank's class will help you get into a more professional mindset where you're putting your skills and talents to use in an efficient and effective manner. Not in a way that'll overwork yourself, but little things to help you figure out what works for you. Considering your work environment and all that. You just checked your email 10 seconds ago, nothing changed. But there's also courses for web development, essential tools in writing stories, and stuff like animation, if you don't feel like blowing thousands of dollars for something you could have easily learned online. And Skillshare is giving away a free trial of their premium membership to the first 1,000 people who can click the link in the description below to help you explore your creativity. And after that, it's only around $10 a month. So much love to Skillshare for the sponsorship, and much love to you as always for helping support this channel. Let's continue on with the show. I've been playing video games for most of my life, since the early 1990s. And when I started, I was mostly into platformers. Super Mario would be the first game I ever completed. Sonic the Hedgehog would soon enter the scene and corrupt my life for the foreseeable future. The Legend of Zelda would show me the joys and hardships of exploration. Metroid did just the same, with more emphasis on the strange and unknown. As I've said before, God knows how many times at this point, I have my uncle to thank for introducing me to most of my childhood favorites. But among them all, there was Final Fantasy. As a kid, I would witness as he controlled 4 characters and slayed all manners of creatures. Wolves, ogres, these big old bug-eyed things, sailing across the seas, taking off to the skies, fumbling through this puzzle slider game, how these cute little guys would transform into these hulking 80s action heroes with furrowed brows. I mean, the warrior looks like a damn football player, you can't tell me otherwise. There was a progression here that, even as a spectator, I was captivated by in my youth. It was different from what I usually saw on the Nintendo, and while there was some initial excitement there, I wouldn't get my first proper Final Fantasy experience until I got to play Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo, although back then, I knew it as Final Fantasy II. Pretty sure you heard that story before, and if not, well, we can save that for later. After my first time with this, which I'm going to get more into when I get to the Final Fantasy IV video proper, I became a bona fide fan of the series, and from that point I wanted my hands on that next installment when it was possible. It was the first time I witnessed that video games could tell stories without having to read an instruction manual. Sure, some are easier to follow than others, but there was an immersion there that was on a different level from what I was playing at the time. That aesthetic and musical compositions could be used to enhance the moment, the scenario. It was my first experience with a role-playing game, one that would leave one hell of a lasting impression. Although my horizons could certainly be expanded, RPGs make up for a significant part of my collection, from Square, Atlas, Namco, Sega, some I purchased out of curiosity, a lot I received through donations from fans throughout the years. But when it comes down to it, Final Fantasy is what I immediately think of when it comes to Japanese role-playing games. It's what I know I can fall back to when I just want to sit down, drink on standby, and have a good time, and for a good decade of my life, it was just that. Starting with Final Fantasy IV, as I've said, I would proceed to follow the series like a hawk, collecting the mainline games whenever I could with allowance money or when I got them as a gift for birthdays or holidays. But a little after Final Fantasy X and X-2 on the PlayStation 2 is when I started to wane away from the series a bit. Call it my rebellious teenage phase. I knew Final Fantasy XI was going to be an MMO, and I wasn't interested in paying for a monthly subscription as someone with no job. And Final Fantasy XII didn't grab me on my first playthrough, and I would end up dropping it just a few hours in. So I take some time away from the series as it was, only coming back to replay games I already loved, or when they got re-released on handhelds like Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI Advanced, or on the Nintendo DS like with Final Fantasy III. I figured starting with Final Fantasy XIII on the PlayStation 3 in 2009 is when I would seriously try getting back into the swing of it. I was 4 years out of high school at this point, I was knee-deep in college work, I wanted something to wind down with, and Final Fantasy XIII didn't exactly do that. Another game I would not finish on my first playthrough, and that's going to be a crystal to crack when we get there. To my surprise, it was Final Fantasy XIV that would reignite that burning passion I haven't felt for the series since Final Fantasy X. An MMO of all things, and it's no secret, especially if you follow me on Twitter, I play a lot of this on my downtime. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and serves as a constant reminder of what I love about the Final Fantasy series as a collective. Man, Final Fantasy XIV in of itself is going to be a massive project for this channel. I'm going to be tackling that expansion by expansion for the record, and don't bother with my old review podcast I did back in 2015. Though that sponsored video would be the spark that set off that enormous, money-guzzling wildfire. I made that video with only about 18 to 20 hours of game time, which if you know your Final Fantasy XIV, that's pathetic. We'll get there when we get there, but today, we're starting off with Square One, the original Final Fantasy on the NES. This would be the game that would put Square on the map, the game that would save them from foreseeable bankruptcy, because Square around this time, I mean, what was Square? A company founded in 1983 that consisted of only a handful of creators and primarily focused on games for personal computers like Nippon Electric and the X-Sharp, just to name a couple of them. And they produced a few games before Final Fantasy was even a thing, from text-based adventures like The Death Trap, the first game they ever released, to something like Cruise Chaser Blasty, which I think is a role-playing game. I don't know what the hell is happening on this screen. Alas, a lot of these games would flop in sales and were only released in Japan, the exception being King's Knight, which despite what the cover might make you think was a scrolling shooter game. There was also the 3D battles of World Runner, Space Harrier in all but name, and then there was Rad Racer, considered one of the NES's best racers to give them some credit. Still, none of these were enough to keep Square afloat as they were, so inspired by the international success of the first Dragon Quest game, which we knew here as Dragon Warrior, Square allowed Hironobu Sakaguchi to take a shot at another role-playing game, but this time actually give it an international release for one thing. And for Mr. Sakaguchi, it was another opportunity to see what he can do with himself, because the man wanted to make a proper RPG with Square, but low sales from previous attempts, namely Cruise Chaser Blasty, nixed that idea until further notice. It got to a point where he wondered if he made the right decision being a game designer at all. Before any of this, he wanted to be a professional musician before getting into game design. I'm not sure how one led to another, but I think it's a story I've heard before. Hell, I wanted to be an art teacher when I went to college, and now I make YouTube videos for a living. And thus, in 1987, my birth year of all things, Final Fantasy was created for the Famicom and released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990. Oof, localization must have been quite a hurdle then, I take it. The name Final Fantasy was long thought to be because it was Square's last-ditch effort to become a successful company, the final being just that, final. If this didn't work out, that was it, Square was done. But I've read conflicting reports on this. An interview with Nobuo Uematsu stated that the final was more centered on Mr. Sakaguchi leaving the gaming business if the game flopped, and not so much Square. But in a later interview with Mr. Sakaguchi himself, he would explain that he wanted the game to be called Fighting Fantasy, but since there was already a tabletop game with that name, he didn't want to risk any legal troubles or complications, and since he wanted the game to be abbreviated as FF, he decided to go with Final, stating that as long as it started with the letter F, it could be anything. Fiesta Fantasy. Yes. Whatever the case, it doesn't really matter in the end anyway. This is Final Fantasy, created by what was considered Square's A-team, including Hironobu Sakaguchi, Kenji Terada, Hiromichi Tanaka, Akitoshi Kawazu, Koichi Ishii, who would later create the Mana series, another RPG franchise, and Nazir Jabeli on programming duties, I think that's how you pronounce his name, with Yoshitaka Amano as the artist, and Nobuo Uematsu as the game's sole composer, and I wanted to start there, if you don't mind. Final Fantasy has some distinguishable covers in their Japanese releases, at least early on, because after a bit they decided to just stick with the logo on a white background. It's pretty boring. And not to go off too much of a tangent here, but if you get the chance, you should look up screenshots of the Nintendo Power Strategy Guide for Final Fantasy, because those illustrations are just so radically different than the Japanese art. I know this was an age where you had to use your imagination to fill in the gaps, but I don't know how the hell they got these kind of 80s machismo designs out of these cute little guys here. And would somebody please help Grandpa over here? He's fucking dying, man. But even if you've never played a Final Fantasy, you likely ran into some of Amano's designs offhand. I mean, they're iconic. The man's been doing designs for the series since its beginning, and from what I understand, he still contributes to the franchise today, even if he isn't the main character designer anymore. I admire his technique with watercolors. I could never do anything like this. It's striking visually speaking. My only gripe being that his designs kind of get homogenous. Not so much in like their outfits, but you can tell me this was the same man and woman dressed in different garbs for a particular day of the week and I believe it. Unless it's like an extravagant character, the dude only has like one face for both genders and loves cool white hair for everybody. Warrior of Light, white hair. Furion, white hair. Fuck, the whole cast of Final Fantasy V according to this dude has white hair. It's a little ridiculous. Still, far be it from me to say the man needs to expand his horizons. He clearly has a style, and for the most part it works. Nobuo Uematsu, on the other hand, this man is my favorite video game composer of all time. even if the RPG in question is mediocre at best or just straight up garbage. If this man is in charge of composing the soundtrack, odds are I'm gonna love it. Now, I'm not a musician. Don't ask me about what it is precisely about his compositions that strike a chord with me, they just do. Character themes, town themes, battle themes, intense themes for action, emotional themes for drama, vocal themes. Until Final Fantasy X, he was the sole composer of mainline Final Fantasy games. That is insane. But clearly, the dude has a tremendous passion for the craft, and I think it's obvious with his music, so obvious. And this dude was primarily self-taught. That's incredible and inspiring, I'd imagine. God, I love this man. It was because of him that Final Fantasy was one of the first video game albums I ever owned. Yeah, before Sonic, before Mario, all of those. When I was in middle school, so this is around 97 to 2001, I would borrow my uncle's CDs of Final Fantasy VI music and burn it into a cassette tape so that I could listen to the soundtrack while I was walking to school. It meant that much to me. And even today, I get all sorts of emotions listening to his work. And you know what? I think that just might be a sign of a phenomenal composer. But alright, enough with the Nobuo Uematsu suck off. I think it's about time we get into the first game proper. And I figure for this video, I'm going to be primarily sticking to the original release on the NES. And I'll be the first to say, regardless of how this video goes down, if you really want to jump into the game that started it all, you are much better playing off the updated re-releases. The original on the NES is pretty jank, to put that lightly. Where do I even begin? Well, let's see. The intelligence stat is busted, so magic power never properly scales as you level up and get stronger. I know tier 3 magic is supposed to later replace tier 2 and tier 1 magic in terms of raw power, but sometimes you want to be conservative with your mana, but your fire ones and your lit ones are still doing only like 20 damage to an enemy that has over 800 HP later in the game. And that's sad. This also means that classes like the Red Mage are just as efficient at casting magic as their more dedicated counterparts, the Black and White Mage. Unless you're a real stickler for those late game spells like Holy or Flare, odds are Red Mages are certainly the better option. They can certainly take more of a beating than a Black Mage. God damn, they're so squishy. There are weapons that are supposed to have secondary effects that makes them better for specific types of monsters. Those secondary effects don't work, so the weapons are just glorified beast sticks that are outclassed by things you can buy in the store. There are also some magic spells that straight up just don't fucking work, like Temper, Dark, or Saber. Some even do the opposite of what they're intended to do, like Lock 2, which instead of decreasing an enemy's evasion by 20 points, instead increases an enemy's evasion by 20 points. Good shit there. But okay, so there are things that don't work and there are things that are broken to some degree. But for what it's worth, the NES version is still more than playable to my surprise. It's been a long time since I played the first game on the Nintendo. If I'm going back, it's with the Origins version on the PlayStation 1 or the Dawn of Souls version on the PlayStation Portable. But since I wanted to honor the first release for this video, I stuck with the NES game. And we'll talk about it as we go along. There's still plenty of bullshit. But I didn't find it overly punishing to play. Yes, it's the first game, there are just some elements that are antiquated by virtue of its age. But there wasn't a fit of rage, there wasn't a point where I said, oh fuck this, I'm just gonna stop playing here. But I think it would help if you played this on an emulator. Get yourself a speed up feature to help blow through those grinding sessions, maybe a save state before a major encounter, or else you gotta go through that whole dungeon again. It's the 21st century, there are workarounds, so save yourself some time, you know what I mean? Or you can just play the updated versions. Final Fantasy Origins for the PlayStation 1 based on the game's WonderSwan release in 2000, which includes some basic quality of life updates, better graphics and better sound. Weapon and spells actually working in this version too, that's a plus. My favorite version though is the Dawn of Souls release. This was a version of the game released for the Game Boy Advance originally, and instead of using spell charges for magic, which limited the number of times you can cast a spell of a certain tier before needing to use a tent or an inn at a town to recharge, this version gives you the traditional magic point system, giving you a lot more freedom with how you approach battles and dungeon travel. Yes, it kinda breaks the game's challenge in half, but it also makes the journey damn comfortable, and I'd rather you be comfortable than frustrated. Though they always said misery builds character, so I don't know, you do what you want. Fuck it, try and beat the super bosses in the optional dungeons. And if you can, do try and get the PSP version, because that's not only based on the GBA release, but it also has absolutely gorgeous visuals that I cannot state enough how much I love. 2D battles never looked so clean in Final Fantasy 1. And major shoutouts to my good friend Linky for helping me get footage of the Origins and PSP rendition of Final Fantasy 1. I do it myself, but my hands are super tight at the moment, and he was able to lend his support. Thanks again, man, you rock. Give his Twitch page some love here, or don't. I'm not your fucking mom. Perhaps one day I'll give these remakes some love in a separate video, because I got a lot to tackle as it is. And I'm not trying to fully record an RPG like 3 different times to cover all the version differences. I mean, with some, I don't really have a choice. I'm looking at you, Final Fantasy 3. But I'm just one man, and it's bad enough some of these games got direct sequels that I gotta look at too. Boy, oh boy. We're in this for the long run. Alright, let's get this started. Honestly, I don't know why I bother with a spoiler bumper when there's not much of a story here. It's the first game, they're keeping it simple for the time being. But okay then, so the elements of the planet are going out of whack. The earth is rotting, the oceans rage, the winds howl, and wildfires plague the land. This is 2020. It's told in legend that under these circumstances, 4 warriors of light, each holding a respective crystal, are destined to appear and restore balance to the world. And almost as if it's an RPG, bam, we got 4 warriors right here, and like that, you're thrown into the adventure where you're traveling the world not only to help the inhabitants with their own problems, but also restoring power to your crystals, or in the original game's case, your orbs. Man, that is so lame by comparison. Crystals are such a mainstay in this series, but here it's balls. But I poke fun at that, but I always liked how you were able to see your orbs slowly recharge as you progressed through the journey and defeated the 4 elemental fiends. A small thing, but I love seeing that real-time progression. Makes me feel like I'm getting there, wherever the hell I'm going. The journey begins right in the outskirts of the first kingdom you visit, Cornelia. Princess Sarah has been kidnapped by Garland, who was once a proud soldier of the Cornelian army. Why'd he do it? Because he's a dick, I don't know. The town is in turmoil, even the queen has locked herself in her room in grief, which is not true because I could walk into the room just fine. The king pleads with the heroes to find Garland and rescue the princess, and thankfully he didn't get very far because all you gotta do is walk north for a bit and there you go, the Temple of the Fiends, his hideout. Got a feeling the king didn't put enough effort into that rescue squad, but whatever, you find Garland, you knock him down, and huzzah, the princess is saved, the bridge to the other part of the continent is fixed, and with the introduction of the Final Fantasy National Anthem, you begin your journey to restore the orbs proper. From this point, you're traveling about your merry way, gathering experience points to build your strength, and getting clues to where you have to go next in order to restore balance to the land. Each orb sort of comes with its own mini-arc, consisting of fetch quests that will eventually lead you to the next elemental dungeon, culminating with a battle against that orb's respective elemental fiend. The Fiend of Earth, Lich, the Fiend of Fire, Marilith, which the NES version can't call her all of that, so they just go with Carrie, the Fiend of Water, Kraken, and finally the Fiend of Wind, Tiamat. When all's said and done, after you've given the witch Matoya her crystal eye, after you awaken the elf prince with some of that good kush, when you rescued the mermaids, when you took the wrong turn in that canoe maze for the 6th time, when you dropped the floater in the desert and got an airship for your troubles, and when you amazed that one girl in that one town with your legs, it all ends with you returning to the Temple of the Fiends where the elemental forces have started to gather. To stop the evil once and for all, you have to travel 2,000 years into the past and stop the source of it all, which turns out to be Garland, believe it or not. But with his new power, he transforms into the mighty Chaos, who has a face for a crotch. But with some blunt force trauma to the head, the evil is defeated for good and peace is restored to the planet, with the legend of your deeds passed on through tales, generations, bard songs, however the hell it works in this era. Meanwhile, you're still probably trying to figure out that damn slider minigame. Though you might think this being an old 80s RPG, it might be what I consider a guide game. No, I was sort of surprised to see that Final Fantasy was pretty straightforward. This is assuming you're talking to all the townspeople and remembering what they say for future reference, which is just a good habit to have in general for any RPG you're playing, and it's not as if this game has a butchered translation, which might be easy to assume given that it's the first game on the NES. That's not the case, conversations are more than legible, and the game even has a bit of a whimsical sense of humor concerning your tendency to check inanimate objects, which are just that, inanimate objects. And then there's things like the description of the exit spell. Lost? No way out? Is it hopeless? Use this spell to exit. Yeah, you little bitch. It is a good idea to maybe write down what people say, because in the original game, you're pretty much responsible for keeping check on new information. This game has no cutscenes. Nothing that's as direct as baked-in story beats that help fill in the blanks. Now there is dialogue, you do interact with things, but it's almost always limited to singular one-box exchanges, and that's all you're getting. There's no character arcs, there's no interactions between the heroes or other characters, none of that. But there is a bit of world building, which I find to be the most interesting thing about this game by proxy. But that in of itself is nothing too amazing. You just get some history behind the world you're traveling in, but because of the minimalistic story, it doesn't amount to anything besides fun facts. This game is nothing but fetch quests. Go here, grab this thing, bring it here, get another thing, take that to where it's needed, lather, rinse, repeat for about 12 to 14 hours. I want to say it's about that long when you first play through. It is the most fundamental shit that really I'm only giving a pass because it's the first game in the series. Things clearly get better onwards. I think they do anyway. But if for whatever reason you were to find yourself playing this, NES or otherwise, the foundation is still solid enough to be playable. As long as you keep exploring and checking up on things, you should not find yourself lost at any point. The game is designed well enough that even when you first get your pirate ship, you're still confined to a certain part of the continent that you can't break out of until you do the proper quests. The game is good with breaking you in, and it's also good at breaking you, period. Yes, there's still a lot of other problems you might face, but knowing where to go is not one of them. And though the presentation is clearly limited by the console's technology, the game looks fine. It won't be long before you start facing recolors of enemies you just fought about 20 minutes ago, but the sprite detail is great for enemies both large and small. The bosses obviously seen the most attention. The soundtrack is also limited. Yeah, it starts to get a little repetitive after a point, especially since some tracks loop after only 10 seconds or so. But the battle theme, despite there only being one in the original, is something I'll never tire of. The victory music is always a joy to my ears, the bullshit being temporarily placated for now. But as strange as this might sound, my favorite theme in the game is the shop music. It's like a bubbly waltz that always gets my head swaying. From the start, you have your 4 Warriors of Light, and before the game even begins, you're free to pick what classes you want your characters to be, each having their own strengths and weaknesses. Except the Thief. Poor Thief. In the NES version, this dude was just not a good class. There's no steal command, so there's already a lack in identity. He couldn't wield all the weapons a fighter could use. He was statistically worse than the fighter altogether. No access to magic until he was upgraded to the ninja class, but even then not on the same level as the black mage or even the red mage. He was supposed to help you run from battles easier, but Final Fantasy on the NES being Final Fantasy on the NES, that feature is bugged and doesn't work. I'm sorry, Thief, but at least you got better with the updated versions. Now, my party composition might seem basic bitch to some, but you can't fuck with the classics. The fighter was the superior physical and defensive tank. He hits hard, he can take a beating, and has some of the best equipment in the game that you mainly found in treasure chests so that you're not spending that much gil on him if you had a knack for exploring. I think he just might be the best class in the game. Yes, in one part because of the jank programming putting other classes at a disadvantage, but I also think he was just inherently designed to be the class perfect for newcomers. There's always a fighter in my party. Fuck, I know folks who rock 2 of them, maybe 3. Red mages are the jack of all trades, not only capable of rocking similar equipment to the fighter, but they can also cast both white and black magic. They don't get the super hard-hitting spells like they do, but the options given makes them extremely versatile. They can buff party members with support in battle, attack multiple enemies with magic spells, or they can help the white mage with healing magic to keep everyone alive. Plus, they probably have the best aesthetic. I love that hat, I love that cape. They got that visual flair that looks good, even in death. Fuck me, man. The more dedicated spellcasters are the white and black mages. White mages specializing in healing magic and defensive spells, with the black mage primarily focusing on offensive magic. They're squishy as all hell, you could look at them weird and they fucking fall on the floor, but with the right selection of magic they can make your team a force to be reckoned with. Got a bunch of monsters attacking you with a specific element? The white mage can help cut that damage in half with the proper spell, while the black mage takes them all out with the proper elemental spell. As early as this game, there is an elemental rock, paper, scissors design when exploiting weaknesses, so take advantage of that when you can, it makes all the difference. The only class that didn't really show any love for this run through, except the Thief, was the Black Belt, who should not be slept on. Though they start off a little weak, and like the Thief they can't cast any magic, they soon grow into a more than capable class that can outdamage the fighter with their bare hands. In fact, if you're looking to save on money through the adventure, get a black belt for your team. You don't need to spend money on weapons for them, since again, they hit hard with their bare hands, and their growing natural defenses ensure that they don't need that super expensive armor in the long run. The black belt sees a problem, and they punch the shit out of it. It's as simple as that. So for my adventure, I went with the fighter, a red mage, a black mage, and a white mage. And with character limits in mind, I made this team brain scratch. Hey, everyone's names could fit in the 4 character limit, it all worked out. Except for Lewis, which I had to make a compromise for. Sorry about that, man. Sadly, the 4 character limit on top of compromised translation also extends to spells and other abilities, which isn't so bad for some of the basic spells. I know what fire does, I know what ice does, but harm? What does that mean? I know fire harms, ice harms. What makes harm harmful? A mutt, lamp, zap, quadruple X, blended, invis, fear, rub, fog 2, which what, I do something with a fog machine? 2 of them? Now I'll defend some of these names. You can't get me to hate Nuke. It's the hardest hitting black magic in the game, as an appropriate name, I feel. Now before you do anything in the game, the first thing you should do is set that response rate to anything other than 1. Put it at around 5 to 6. This is basically what controls the battle speed, how fast attack and command prompts appear and read out. At the default setting, even a battle against your most basic imps can take longer than erosion. It's so fucking slow. But this is the basic gist of Final Fantasy's combat. You got 4 characters who walk along the world map looking for the next town or dungeon to visit, and there are random encounters. Creatures as small as imps and wolves to monstrosities like ogres, giants, minotaurs, whatever the hell this is supposed to be, mad ponies, bad man, nachos, air, and fish. When I was a kid, I liked seeing the different backgrounds that reflected the current environment you face the encounter in, but the all-black floor also made me think everyone was fighting on asphalt, so it's less a mystical role-playing game and more like everyone's LARPing at a Walmart parking lot. Still, it's you against them, and though there are 4 of you, enemies have nothing against attacking in packs of 4, 5, all the way to fucking 9. God, you can fight so many enemies at once. So when the battle begins, assuming you didn't get ambushed where the enemy attacks first, you choose your commands with your characters. For basic attacks, a magic spell if you have the spell charge to spare, or you can use an item to help heal, remove a status effect, or maybe you can use an item to dish out the pain. Whatever it is, you have all the time in the world to do it because battles are turn-based. When you made your final command with your 4th character, you then watch things play out. See what attacks landed, which ones missed, which early in the game might be more than what you're comfortable with because your hit ratio starts off so small. There's also the matter of your character swinging at fucking nothing. If 2 characters choose the same target but it's gone before the other player acts, they don't just retarget an enemy that's still clearly there. Ineffective. No shit.
Piss off, Ghost! He's freaking gone.
You're also witnessing just how bad the enemies mess you up, which at the start is nothing too bad, but when you get into fights where there's like 6 of these fucking guys, oh geez, if they decide to gang up on one character, it's almost guaranteed to kill them. And guess what? If a character dies, no way to bring them back in battle. Oh, you can get a life spell later on, but it can only be used outside of battle, and there's no traditional Phoenix Downs here either, unless you're playing the remakes. Again, play the remakes if you want a better time. God, I can't overstate how much death fucking sucks in this game because you're so crippled if it happens to one of your powerhouses. Whenever my fighter would drop, odds were good that I was resetting my game and trying again because he was my main damage dealer, and my red mage wasn't up to snuff just yet. Fuck, most of my strategy, especially by late game, would amount to me casting fast on the fighter and red mage to increase their damage, and watching them melt down bosses with their obnoxiously strong physical attacks. It's such an overpowered spell, but for some of these encounters that doesn't mean shit just because of either the sheer number of things you run into at once, or if they have instant kill attacks that just shits on your day. The sorcerers in the ice cave, oh my god, fuck the sorcerers so much. Fuck the ice cave in general, easily one of the toughest, if not the toughest dungeon because of the encounters alone. You run into so many of these douchebags, and their physical attacks, they can just one-shot you randomly. And it doesn't even need to be instant kill attacks. Something like paralysis can be so dreadfully annoying. Enemies like ghouls can stun you with their attacks, which prevents you from acting until you shake it off. But when you got 7 or 8 of these fuckers and they get you in an ambush, you can't fucking do anything. You're just watching your characters getting pot shot repeatedly, and then when you can move, you try and run away, but it doesn't work, you get stunned again. Oh Christ, I gotta fast forward through this shit. It's a glorified screensaver. And say if it's your white mage down for the count, or your red mage, whatever you decide to do, the only way you're getting them back up is by going back to a town and resurrecting them in the church, or the clinic in the American version. Can't wait to see that medical bill, I don't have any insurance. Death can be an enormous roadblock to what can already be an arduous journey through a cave or a dungeon. And I'm not talking the dungeon layouts themselves, they're not necessarily complex. In fact, I don't think any area in the game is what I consider perplexing. But some, like the Earth Cave, requires that you visit it twice given how events played out, and some require multiple visits because, well shit man, it's the enemies you run into, both from random encounters and those you fight when you walk across specific tiles on the floor, booby traps basically. And most of those fights can either be things that can smack you really hard, or encounters that you just can't run away from period, forcing you to fight, like with the wizards. Standard RPG design usually has the small fry wear you down before you take on the big boss at the end, the true challenge. But here it's like the opposite, the small fry are the bosses, and the bosses themselves are not much to deal with at all. Case in point, the War Mech, an encounter you can face right before you fight Tiamat. It has a low encounter rate, so it's unlikely you'll run into this death machine at all. But if you're unfortunate enough to do so, welcome to hell. Hardest encounter in the game, and it isn't even a boss. Super high defenses, incredible speed, and some of the nastiest attacks in the game, including one called Nuclear, about as straight and to the point as nuke. Fuck this guy. It gives you a shitload of experience and money if you beat him, but is it worth the torment? I don't think so. I just do it for bragging rights, which what the fuck does that mean in the end? And with the exception to the fiend battles, or until you get enough experience and money to purchase something like the warp or exit spell, allowing you to leave immediately, when you're done with what you gotta do in the dungeon, you gotta make that hike all the way back to the entrance, meaning more encounters, more booby traps, and more wasted resources that are already incredibly finite. Now I'm talking more about your mage's spell charges more than anything, because inventory space isn't that big of a deal, shockingly. Sure, whenever you find new armor or weapons, it's annoying that they immediately go onto a character regardless of their ability to equip it or not, effectively only giving you around 16 spots for new and current equipment. But for miscellaneous stuff, basic potions and antidotes for status effects, you always have room for those because they get their own spots and they stack up. I wish there was a way I could sort items so that my heal potions were the first thing I select, because having to repeatedly move the cursor over to the item after every individual use feels more annoying than it has the right to. But even towards the very end of the game, You want to make sure you have a full stock of potions and antidotes because you can't be over-reliant on magical spells, you only have so many at a given time. Instead of magic points, mages have spell charges, a certain number of times you can cast a spell in a specific tier. Now the higher your character's level, the more charges you get, but different tiers of spells share the same spell charges. So if say you're having trouble keeping your characters alive, you want to save your level 5 spell charges for your life spell, but your life spell also shares the same tier as your second level heal spell, so if you use life too many times, you suddenly have no more level 5 charges to use that second heal spell, or even your cure 3, meaning you're out of a good healing option altogether. And now you gotta rely on either your weaker spells, which get less and less useful as you level up considering the broken intelligence stat I mentioned earlier, or you go and blow your once in a lifetime super heal spell way earlier than you intended. Dungeons & Dragons veterans might recognize this battle system because from what I understand, the original Final Fantasy is just 1st edition D&D with little to no shame. I can't say for sure how much they ate from D&D, I never played a single campaign of the game to make a full comparison unless, I don't know, do I count this game? But hey, they wanted a winning formula to make sure this game was a success, and what was more successful at this time than D&D, Ultima, and Wizardry? And it's so weird because they didn't want to call the game fighting fantasy out of potential concerns with copyright and all that, but then they just straight up rip off D&D for the battle mechanics. Even the design of the eye monster had to be changed overseas because in Japan, it was just straight out the Beholder, a staple D&D monster. So make it obvious, but not too obvious. Fuck, that's too obvious. Make it less obvious. Video games. It does get a little better for mages down the road though, because at some point you'll start getting equipment and weapons that when used as items, cast a spell or gives you a buff. I'm talking heals for your whole party, 2nd tier lightning and fire magic, evasion buffs that you get from a white t-shirt, and you can do this as many times as you want, no spell charges required. For my white and black mage, when dealing with dungeon fodder, it was my main method of attack and defense, allowing me to save my spell charges for the unavoidable encounters and boss fights. I'm happy it eases up, but man, still not too big on spell charges as a concept. I'm glad it was dropped after this game, just to make that clear. This battle system is antiquated, especially if you're heavily magic-centric, because if you're big on just physical fighters, then it isn't too bad. Physical fighters got it good. You look up videos, let's plays, or speed runs, and unless they're deliberately doing something like an all-white mage challenge run, they're relying on their fighters, their red mages, and their black belts to dish out the real pain. Everyone else is merely supplemental. Though things get better for everyone when you tackle the Castle of Ordeals, and get that stinky-ass rat tail, which you then later give to Bahamut, the king of the dragons. You do that and everyone gets a class upgrade. This was always my favorite part of the game because it exemplifies more than anything that your characters are growing, they're getting stronger. Yeah, your stats go up, the numbers get larger, but visually it's never been more obvious, and now they all got those thick eyebrows. Not bad for what I always considered a bunch of middle-aged fucks going through a midlife crisis, at least that's what I always got from their appearances on the Nintendo Power Strategy Guide. Look at the thief, look at him. Even he knows how much he got fucked over, and I think his leg is broken. Despite the battle system's shortcomings, there's still a lot of little things I enjoy about the first Final Fantasy. Shit, as soon as I get the pirate ship, I can already feel the possibilities open up before me. And I like traveling south with the ship because the front looks like a giant ice cream cone. But anyway, I can sail to the next town, maybe get the next objective done, or I can spend time leveling up in the Peninsula of Power. You can fight enemies here that you're not supposed to fight for a long time, but with the right spells and a little bit of luck, the benefits greatly outweigh the detriments. I can power through the later dungeons with a wide array of spells, raking in that money that I can spend on those new spells you can get in shops at the local town and not a moment sooner, because fuck, some of these new spells can get super expensive. But money is something you should be drowning in towards the second half of the game, even if you don't grind that much, because treasure chests often give money by the boatload, or they have weapons that you can pawn off because their secondary effects don't work, effectively making them more money drops. I had more money that I can spend by the end of it all. Even after maxing out my potion count, my fingers have never been so tired, needing to buy every potion one fucking bottle at a time, goddamn! It's an old game, but if you're willing to look past that jank, it's still more than playable. I don't really see the need to when there are better, more functional versions available nowadays. Again, I mainly stuck with the NES version because of nostalgia, but I feel there's always a certain curiosity one might have to see how the original rendition of the first game in a franchise plays out, you know? It wasn't this game that made me a fan, you know, I'm starting here because it's the beginning of a new marathon with me, but it was enough to make Final Fantasy a name for not only Square, but for the whole JRPG scene. Square finally had something going here, and now it was just a matter of improving upon the formula and making a truly stellar follow-up. And for my next venture into the Final Fantasy series, we're going to see how well they followed up with the originally Japanese-only Final Fantasy II. Okay, already making sequels exclusive to one region. That's not a good sign, but I guess we'll see what we're really getting into here next time. As always, thank you all for watching. Stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask if you decide to go outside, get vaccinated if possible. Have yourselves a fantastic night, and take care.